34. But Sonia, ah Sonia, from his nighttime thoughts about the glorious and dark expedition, from his literary chats with Bubnov, from his daily labors at the tennis club, he would return to her again and again and hold a match over the gas stove for her, whereupon, with a loud gush, the blue flame would extend all his claws. To talk to her of love was useless, but once, while walking her home from the cafe, where they imbibed Swedish punch through straws to the wail of a Romanian violin, he was overwhelmed with such soft passion because of the warm night, and because in every doorway there stood a motionless couple, so infectious was their gaiety and whispering, and sudden silences, and the crepuscular undulation of lilacs in villa gardens, the fantastic shadows with which the light of a street lamp animated the scaffolding of a house, and the procession of renovation, that he forgot his usual reserve, his usual fear that Sonia would make fun of him, and by some miracle began to speak of what? Of Horace. Yes, Horace had lived in Rome, and Rome, just by a good number of marble edifices, looked like a sprawling village, and there you could see people chasing after a mad dog, and hogs splashed in the mud with their black piglets. And construction was going on all over the place. Carpenters hammered away, a wagon carrying Ligurian marble or an enormous pine would clatter past, but toward evening the racket would cease, just as Berlin grew silent at twilight, after which came the rattle of iron chains from shops being shut for the night, quite like the rattling of the Berlin shops' shutters at closing time, and Horace strolled off to the field of Mars, debile but paunchy, with a bald head and big ears, clad in a sloppy toga, and listened to the tender whispers under the porticos, to the enchanting laughter in the dark nooks. "You're such a dear," Sonia said all at once, "that I have to kiss you." "Wait, let's go over there." Near a park gate, under the overflow of dark foliage, Martin pulled Sonia to him, and so as not to lose the least part of that moment, he did not close his eyes as a reflection of pale light on her cheek, and the quivering of her lowered eyelids, they rose for an instant, revealing a moist, blind glistening, and shut again. Little shivers shook her. Her lips parted under his, but breaking the spell, her hand had pushed his face aside, and her teeth were chattering. In a half-whisper she implored him to stop. "And what if I'm in love with somebody else?" asked Sonia with unexpected vivacity, when they were once again strolling along the street. "That would be awful," said Martin. He sensed there had been a moment when he could have taken a firm hold of Sonia, but now she had flipped away again. "Remove your arm," she remarked. "I can't walk like that. You behave like a Sunday shop clerk." And his last hope, the blissful sensation of her warm upper arm under the palm of his hand, vanished also. "At least he has talent," she said, "and you're nothing. You're just a traveling playboy." "Talent? Whom are you talking about?" She did not answer and kept silent all the way home. She did, however, kiss him again on the doorstep, throwing her bare arm around his neck, and her expression was serious and her gaze downcast as she locked the door from the outside. He watched through the door pane. There she goes, up the stairs, caressing the banister, and now the stair bend conceals her, and that is her light going out. She did the same to Darwin, thought Martin, and he felt a tremendous urge to see his old friend Darwin, however, was far away in America, on an assignment for a London newspaper. Next day all trace of romance had vanished, as if it had ever been, and Sonia went with friends to the country, to Peacock Island, for a swim and a picnic, and Martin didn't even know about it. That evening, a minute before closing time, he had brought a large crimson-ribboned plush dog, and was approaching her house with the thing under his arm when he met the whole returning party on the street. Sonia and Kalistratov's jacket over her shoulders, and between him and her there flashed repeatedly a chance jest, whose meaning nobody bothered to explain to Martin. He wrote her a letter and stayed away for several days. She replied a week or so later with a color postcard showing a pretty boy bending over the back of a green bench on which sat a pretty girl, admiring a bouquet of roses, with a German rhyme in gilt letters at the bottom. "Let a true heart leave unsaid what is told by roses red." On the reverse, Sonia had scribbled, "Aren't they sweet? That's real courtship for you. Look, I need your assistance. The strings have snapped on my racket." And not a word about the letter. However, during one of his next visits, she said, "I think it's ridiculous you can't skip a day or two now and then. Surely Kinderman will replace you." "He has his own lessons," replied Martin hesitantly, but he did speak to Kinderman. And so one marvelous, impeccably cloudless morning, Martin and Sonia were off for the Lacustrine, reedy, piney outskirts of the city, and Martin heroically kept his promise not to make marmalade eyes, as she put it, and did not attempt to kiss her. Something they discussed that day happened to lead to a series of quiet, special exchanges between them. With the intent of striking Sonia's imagination, Martin vaguely alluded to his having joined a secret group of anti-Bolshevist conspirators that organized reconnaissance operations. It was perfectly true that such a group did exist. In fact, a common friend of theirs, one Lieutenant Melkik, had twice crossed the border on dangerous missions. It was also true that Martin kept looking for an opportunity to make friends with him. Once he had even invited him to dinner, and always regretted that while in Switzerland he had not yet met the mysterious Guzanov, whom Zilanov had mentioned, and who, according to information Martin had gathered, emerged as a man of great adventures, a terrorist, a very special spy, and the mastermind of recent peasant revolts against the Soviet rule. It never occurred to me, said Sonia, that you thought about things like that. Only, if you really have joined that organization, it's very naive to start babbling about it right away. Oh, I was only joking, said Martin, and slid his eyes enigmatically, so as to make Sonia believe he had deliberately turned it into a joke. She, however, did not catch that nuance. Stretched out on the dry, needle-strewn ground, beneath the pines whose trunks the sun blotched with color, she put her bare arms behind her head, exposing her lovely armpits, which she had recently started to shave, and which were now shaded as if with a pencil, and said it with a strange thing. But she too had often thought about it, about there being a land where ordinary mortals were not admitted. What shall we call that land? Asked Martin, suddenly recollecting his games with Lita or the Crimean fairy tale shore. Some northern name, answered Sonia. Look at that squirrel. The squirrel, playing hide-and-seek, jerkily climbed a tree trunk and vanished amidst the foliage. Zorland, for example, said Martin. A Norman mariner mentions it. Yes, of course, Zorland, Sonia concurred, and he grinned broadly, somewhat astounded by her unexpectedly revealed capacity for daydreaming. May I remove an ant? He asked parenthetically. Depends where. Stalking. Scram, chum, addressing the ant. She brushed it off and continued as if reciting. Winters are cold there, and monster icicles hang from the eaves. A whole system of them, like organ pipes. They melt, and everything gets very watery, and there are soot-like specks on the thawing snow. Oh, I can tell you everything about it. For instance, they've just passed a law that all inhabitants must shave their heads, so that now the most important, most influential people are the barbers. Equality of head, said Martin. Yes, and of course the bald ones are best off. And Bubnov would have a grand time there, Martin interjected facetiously. For some reason Sonia took offense and dried up. Yet from that day on she occasionally condescended to play Zorland with him, and Martin was tormented by the thought that she might be making sophisticated fun of him, and that any moment she might cause him to take a false step, prodding him toward the boundary beyond which phantasmata became tasteless, and the dream walker is jolted into seeing the roof edge from which he is dangling, his own hiked-up nightshirt, the crowd looking up from the sidewalk, the firemen's helmets. But even if this was a form of derision on Sonia's part, no matter. He enjoyed the opportunity to let himself go in her presence. They studied Zorlandian customs and laws. The region was rocky and windy, and the wind was recognized as a positive force, since by championing equality and not tolerating towers and tall trees, it only subserved the public aspirations of atmospheric strata that kept diligent watch over the uniformity of the temperature. And naturally, pure arts, pure science were outlawed, lest the honest dunces be hurt to see the scholar's brooding brow and offensively thick boots. Shaven-headed, wearing brown cassocks, the happy Zorlanders warmed themselves by bonfires as the strings of burning violins snapped with loud reports, and discussed plans to level the land by blowing out mountains that stuck up too presumptuously. Sometimes during the general conversation, at a table, for instance, Sonia would suddenly turn to him and quickly whisper, Have you heard there's a new law forbidding caterpillars to pupate? Or, I forgot to tell you, Xavier and Mahler, the sobriquet of one of the chieftains, has ordered physicians to stop casting around and to treat all illnesses in exactly the same way. 35. When he returned from the winter to Switzerland, Martin looked forward to an entertaining correspondence, but Sonia made no mention of Zorland in her infrequent letters. In one of them, however, she asked him to give her father's regards to Guzanov. It turned out that Guzanov was staying in the Majestic, the hotel that had had such an odd attraction for Martin, but when he skied down to it, he found that Gruzanov had left and would be away for some time. He transmitted Zelenov's regards to Gruzanov's wife, a young-looking, brightly dressed lady in her 40s with blue-black hair and a cautious smile that attempted to conceal protruding front teeth, always smeared with lipstick. Martin had never seen such exquisite hands as hers. They were small and soft and adorned with glowing rings, but though everybody considered her attractive and admitted her grace and melodious, caressive voice, Martin's senses remained unstirred. In fact, it irked him to think that maybe she was trying to charm him. His suspicions were unfounded. Miss Gruzanov was indifferent to him as to the tall, big-nosed Englishman with gray, bristly hair on his narrow head and striped scarf around his neck who took her sleigh riding. "My husband won't be back before July," she said, and began questioning Martin about the Zelenovs. Yes, I do pity her mother," Martin had mentioned Irina. "You know, don't you, how it all started?" Martin knew. During the Civil War in southern Russia, Irina, now a quiet, plump, normal, though melancholy girl of 14, was on a train with her mother. They had to be content with a bench in a freight car, jammed with all sorts of riffraff, and during the long journey 2 rowdies, ignoring the protests of some of their pals, palpated, pinched, and tickled the child, saying monstrous obscenities to her. Miss Pavlov, wearing the smile of helpless horror, and doing her best to protect her, kept repeating, "Never mind, Irochka, never mind. Oh, please leave the child alone. You should be ashamed of yourselves. Never mind, Irochka." Then on the next train, nearer to Moscow, with similar cries and mutterings, she again cradled her daughter's head with other roughs. Deserters or the like ejected her corpulent husband by squeezing him through the very window of the train going full speed. As he was very fat and he laughed hysterically, having got stuck halfway through, but finally, with an unanimous heave-ho, they succeeded. He disappeared from sight, and there only remained the blind snow driving past the empty window. Miraculously, he rejoined his family at some little railway station buried in the snow, and miraculously, too, Irina survived a severe typhoid infection, but she lost the power of speech, and it was only a year later in London that she learned to produce mooing sounds with different intonations and pronounce mama with tolerable clarity. Martin, who somehow had never paid much attention to Irina, having soon become used to her mental deficiency, now experienced a strange shock as Miss Gruzanov added, "That's how they have in their home a permanent living symbol." That night, Azorland seemed to him even darker, its wildwood deeper, and Martin already knew that nothing and nobody could prevent him from penetrating as a free pilgrim into those woods where plump children are tortured in the dark, and a smell of burning and of putrefaction permeates the air. When he returned in the spring to Berlin and Sonia, he could have almost believed, so crowded with adventures had been his winter night fantasies, that he had already concluded that solitary and courageous expedition, and now was going to talk and talk about his adventures. As he entered her room, he said, being anxious to express it before the familiar, frustrating effect of her lusterless eyes had reasserted itself, like this, I shall return some day. And then, then, there'll never be anything," she exclaimed in the tones of Pushkin's Diana. "Hero, I still do not love thee." She was even paler than usual. Her office work was very fatiguing. At home she wore an old black velvet dress with a narrow leather belt round the hips, and backless slippers with frayed pompons. Often after supper she would put on her raincoat and leave, and Martin, after strolling aimlessly from room to room for a time, would leave too and walk slowly to the streetcar stop, hands deep in trouser pockets. At the opposite end of Berlin, he would whistle tenderly under the window of a cabaret dancer whom he had met in a tennis club. She flitted out onto the balcony, froze for an instant at its parapet, disappeared, flitted out again, and tossed him the house key wrapped in paper. In her bedroom, Martin drank green creme de menthe and kissed her naked golden brown back, and tossing her head, she would tightly contract her shoulder blades. He liked to watch her as she rapidly paced the room, setting close together her muscular sun-tanned legs and furiously revealing always the same theatrical agent. He liked her bizarre little face with its orange-tinted encardining, unnaturally thin eyebrows, and smoothly brushed back hair, and he vainly tried not to think of Sonia. One night in May he emitted his soft whistle with a special trill, but instead of his mistress, an elderly man in braces came out onto the balcony, and Martin sighed and walked away. He went back by tram to the Zilanov street and started to walk back and forth between 2 lamps. Sonia returned past midnight alone, and while she rummaged in her handbag for search of her keys, Martin approached her and asked timidly where she had been. "Won't you ever leave me alone?" cried Sonia, and without waiting for an answer, turned her key with a double crunch. and the heavy door swung open and stopped for a moment, banged shut. Then came a time when Martin began to imagine that not only Sonia, but all their common acquaintances were avoiding him, and that he was unwanted, that no one cared for him, that he dropped in on Bubnov, and the latter stared at him in an odd way, excused himself, and continued to write. At last, feeling that after a little more of this he would turn into Sonia's shadow, and to the end of his life continue to haunt Berlin sidewalks, wasting on futile passion on the important and solemn thing that was ripening in him, Martin decided to have done with Berlin in order to think over, in purifying solitude, the plan of the expedition. In mid-May 1924, with the ticket for Strasbourg already in his wallet, he went to take leave of Sonia, and of course did not find her at home. Amidst the twilight of the room, all in white, sat Irena, seeming to float in the dusk like a ghostly turtle. She did not take her eye off him. He wrote on an envelope, "Polar night decreed in Zorland," put it on the pillow in Sonia's room, got into the waiting taxicab, and wearing neither overcoat nor hat, with only one bag left for the station. 36. As soon as the train began to move, Martin revived, regained his gaiety, began to enjoy the excitement of traveling, something that he considered to be a kind of indispensable training. When he transferred to a French train going south by way of Lyon, it seemed to him that he was definitely free of Sonia's nebulous spells. Beyond Lyon, the southern night gradually spread overhead. The pale rectangles of the reflected coach windows sped along the black bank, and the dirty, insufferably stuffy second-class compartment, Martin's only companion, was a middle-aged Frenchman. The man discarded his coat, and in one downward run of his fingers undid all the buttons of his waistcoat, pulled off his cuffs of his ends, screwing off his wrists, and carefully placed the two starched cylinders in the baggage net. He perched on the edge of the seat, and swaying, the train was going fast, with lifted chin, he unfastened his collar and tie, and since the tie was of a ready-made variety that unhooked the back, one again had the impression that here was a man taking himself apart and about to remove his head. The front skin of the neck was as flabby as a turkey's. He moved his head right and left with relief, then bit over and grunted, changed from boots to bedroom slippers. With his shirt opened on his curly chest, he now looked like a hearty enough fellow who had had one too many for those fellow travelers in a night coach, with their shiny pale faces and glazed eyes, always appear to be drunk with the carriages swaying in heat. From a hamper he produced a bottle of red wine and a large orange. First he took a swallow from the bottle, smacked his lips forcefully, pressed home the squeaking cork, then began to strip the orange with his thumb after biting open the skin on its pate. At this moment his eyes met those of Martin, who had just put down his Stoschnes on its knee in preparation for a yawn, and the Frenchman spoke. "We're already in Provence," he said jovially, one shaggy eyebrow pointing toward the window, in whose mirror-black glasses his dim double was peeling an orange too. "Oui, on Saint-le-Sud," answered Martin. "You're an Englishman?" queried the other, tearing his two-peeled, gray-tufted orange. "Correct," answered Martin. "How did you guess?" The Frenchman, chewing juicily, shrugged one shoulder. "It was not very hard," he said, swallowed, and after a look of inspection, pointed a hairy finger at the Toshnes. Martin smiled indulgently. "And I'm from Lyon." The Frenchman continued, "I'm in the wine business. I have to travel a lot, but I like to be moving about. One gets to see new places, new people, the world. Quoi? I have a wife and a small daughter," he added, wiping with a bit of newspaper the tips of his spread-out fingers, then contemplating Martin again, his battered bag and wrinkled trousers, and concluding that a British milord would hardly be traveling second class, he observed with an anticipatory nod, "You're a traveler?" Martin understood that this was a mere abbreviation for commercial traveler. "Yes, I am indeed a traveler," he answered, diligently imitating a British accent, but in a wider sense of the word. "I am traveling very far." "But you are in the commerce?" Martin shook his head. "Then you are doing it for pleasure?" "If you like," said Martin. The Frenchman ruminated in silence. Presently he asked, "At the moment you're going to Marseille, aren't you?" "Yes, probably to Marseille. Not all my preparations are completed yet." The Frenchman nodded, but was visibly puzzled. "In such cases," Martin went on, "the preparations must be made with the greatest care. I spent close to a year in Berlin, where I had hoped to obtain some essential information, and you can't imagine my nephew is an engineer," the Frenchman hopefully interposed. "Oh no, I am not concerned with technology. That was not why I visited Germany. But as I was saying, you can't imagine how difficult it is to ferret out that sort of information. The fact is, I'm planning to explore a certain remote, almost inaccessible region. It has been reached by a few adventurers, but how to find them and how to make them talk. What do I have? Only a map. And Martin pointed to his valise, which indeed contained, besides his silk shirts and collapsible tub, a map on a scale of vershock to a verst, acquired in Berlin at the former military headquarters. There followed a silence. The train clattered and swayed. I always affirmed, the Frenchman said, that our colonies have a great future. Naturally, yours do too, and you have so many of them. One of my friends spent 10 years in the tropics, and he says he would gladly go back. He told me how once he saw monkeys using a fallen tree trunk to cross a river, each holding the tail of one in front. It was devilishly droll. Holding tails. Colonies are something else again, said Martin. I'm not planning to go to our colonies. My trail will likely take me through perilous places, and who knows, I may not be able to return. Is that a scientific expedition or something? Asked the Frenchman, squashing a yawn with his back teeth. Partly, but how shall I put it? Science, knowledge, all that is not the main point. The main purpose is... No, I really don't know how to explain. I know, said the Frenchman wearily. You, les Anglais, are fond of wagers, of records. His record sounded like a drowsy growl. Who wants a bare rock in the sky? Or, good Lord, how sleepy one gets on a train? Or icebergs, or whatever one calls them? Or indeed the North Pole? Or those marshes where one perishes from malaria? Yes, you may have put your finger on it, and yet, even the sport is not all. There are besides, how should I say, glory, love, tenderness for the soil, 1,000 rather mysterious feelings. The Frenchman gaped, then moving forward, lightly slapped Martin on the knee. One is mocking me, eh? He commented good-naturedly. Oh, no, not at all. Come, he said, leaning back in his corner. You are too young to roam the Saharas. With your permission, I'll now put out the light and take a nap. 37. Darkness. Almost at once the Frenchman began to snore. Yes, he did believe I was English. En zone le sud. Like this I shall travel north, exactly like this, in a coach that one cannot stop. After that, he began to follow his forest path. The path unwound, kept unwinding, but sleep did not come to meet him. Martin opened his eyes. Good idea to lower the window. A mild night flooded his face, and straining his eyes, Martin leaned out, but invisible dust flew into his eyes. Speed blinded him. He drew back his head. A cough resounded in the darkened compartment. No, be so kind, said a cross voice. I have no desire to sleep under the stars. Close it. Close it yourself, said Martin. He stepped out into the lighted corridor and walked past the compartments where one could guess the jumbled presence of slumbering, helpless, half-undressed bodies, wheezes and sighs, mouths opened fish fashion, a sinking head jerking up again, a soft foot right next to a stranger's nose, making his way from one vestibule to another across a grind of connecting plates. Martin passed through 2/3 class coaches. The sliding doors of some compartments stood open, and one of them, gray-blue soldiers, were noisily playing cards. Further on in the corridor of a sleeping car, Martin stopped at a half-lowered window and recalled with exceptional clarity his childhood journey through the southern France. That strapontin seat by the window, that cloth loop which permitted him to drive the train, that lovely melody in 3 languages, especially Pericoloso. He reflected what a strange life had fallen to his lot. It seemed as if he had never left a fast train, had merely wandered from car to car, and one was occupied by young Englishmen, among whom was Darwin in the act of solemnly taking hold of the emergency cord. In the other were Allah and her husband, or else the Crimean crowd, or snoring Uncle Henry of the Zelenovs, her father with his eternal newspaper, and Sonia, her velvet dark eyes staring through the window. And then I'll continue on foot, muttered Martin excitedly. A forest, a winding path, what huge trees! Here in this sleeping car his childhood must have traveled, must have shivered as it undid the button of his leathern blind. As if one followed the blue corridor a little farther, one would get to the dining car where his parents had supper, and there would be on the table the same mock-up of a chocolate bar in a violet wrapping, and over the door a helical ventilator would shimmer in a garden of ads. At that moment, in response to his recollections, Martin saw through the window what he had seen as a child, a necklace of lights far away among dark hills. Someone seemed to pour them from one hand into the other and pocket them. While he looked, the train began to slow down, and Martin told himself that if it stopped he would get off and go in search of those lights. A station platform drifted into sight, then the moonlight disk of a clock, and the train came to a halt, exhaling a sigh. Martin dashed back to his coach, twice burst into the snoring dark of a wrong compartment and found the right one, snapped on the light, and the Frenchman half rose from his seat, rubbing his eyes with his fists. Martin jerked down his valise, snatched up his Stolchnitz. In his haste, he failed to notice that the train had begun to move again, and thereby nearly fell when they jumped down onto the gliding platform. A long row of windows passed by and were gone. Nothing remained except empty rails with the glitter of coal dust between them. Still panting, Martin traversed the platform. A porter, who was pushing a luggage cart with a big box labeled "Fragile," said to him gaily, with the metallic accent peculiar to Provence, "You woke up at the right moment, monsieur." "Tell me," Martin inquired, "what's in that box?" The porter looked at it as if not only just noticed his presence, but read out the address. "Museum of Natural Science." "Ah, yes, a collection of insects, no doubt," said Martin, and walked toward the little group of tables at the entrance of the dimly lit buffet. The air was velvety and warm. Around a milky white arc light swirled pale midges and one ample dark moth with hoary margins. A 6-foot poster adorned the wall. It was an attempt on the part of the War Department to picture for the benefit of young men the allurements of military service. In the foreground, a valiant French soldier. In the back, a date palm, a dromedary, and a burnoosed Arab. In the corner, 2 opulent forms in chair shafts. The platform was deserted. A little way down stood some cages with sleeping hens. On the farther side of the rails, one could make out a triangle of black bushes. The air smelled of coal, juniper, and urine. A dusky old woman looked out of the buvette, and Martin asked for an aperitif whose delightful name he had seen advertised. A workman in blue sat down next to the table and fell asleep with his hat on his arm. "There is something I would like to know," said Martin to the woman, just before the train stopped. "I saw lights in the distance." "Where? Was it there?" she asked, pointing in the direction from which the train had arrived. Martin nodded. "That could only have been Mollenac," she said. "Yes, Mollenac, a small village." Martin paid and walked with his bag toward the exit. A dark square, plain trees, a row of ghostly houses, and a narrow street. He had already turned into it when he realized he had forgotten to look at the station sign, and now did not know the name of the town where he chanced to be. It thrilled him pleasantly. Who knows, perhaps by some caprice of space he was already beyond the Zorland border in the uncertain night, and presently would be challenged. 38. When he woke up the next morning, Martin could not at once reconstruct the previous day, and the reason why he woke up was that flies were tickling his face. A remarkably soft bed, an ascetic washstand, and beside it a toilet utensil in the shape of a violin. Hot blue light was breathing through a chink in the window curtain. It was a long time since he had had such a good night's sleep, a long time since he had been so hungry. He drew the curtain aside and saw before him a dazzling white hall. Further off to the left there were shops with striped awnings. A piebald dog sat on the pavement, scratching behind its ear with a hind paw, and a streamlet of glittering water ran along the curb. The sound of the bell button he pressed resounded through the entire story inn, and stomping boldly there arrived a bright-eyed, dirty maid. He ordered a lot of bread, a lot of butter, a lot of coffee, and when she had brought it out, asked her how he could get to Mollenac. She proved to be talkative and inquisitive. Martin mentioned casually that he was German. He had been sent here by a museum to collect insects. At this she glanced pensively at the wall, where there were some suspicious-looking reddish-brown dots. Gradually it transpired that a moth, maybe even before, a bus line would be established between the town and Mollenac. "It means one has to walk?" asked Martin. 15 kilometers, exclaimed the maid with horror. What an idea, and in this heat! He left his things at the inn, and having bought a map of the region at the tobacconist's, whose sign was a tricolor pipe protruding over the door, started to stride down the sunny side of the street, and immediately noticed that his open shirt collar and absence of headgear were attracting general attention. The town seemed drawn in bright chalks and was sharply divided into light and shadow. It boasted numerous pastry shops. Presently the crowded houses dropped away, and the paved road between its double row of huge plane trees with flesh-colored patterns on their green trunks went flowing past vineyards. The rare people he met, such as stonebreakers, school-children, and country wives in black straw hats, ate him up with their eyes. It occurred to Martin to try something that might prove useful in the future. He proceeded to advance with the utmost stealth, crossing ditches and hiding behind brambles whenever he glimpsed in the distance a cart drawn by a donkey in black blinders, or a dusty ramshackle motor van. After a couple of kilometers he abandoned the road altogether and began to work away parallel to it along the hillside, where he was screened by the oak shrub, the glossy myrtles, the nettle trees. Sun blazed fiercely, cicadas trilled. The hot, spicy smells made him dizzy. For a moment he lay in the shade, wiping his sticky neck with his handkerchief. A glance at the map showed him that the 5th kilometer of the road made a loop, and that to rejoin it, one might cut across yonder hill, all yellowing with flowering broom. When he came down on the other side, the white snake of the road did reappear, and as he walked on parallel to it through the fragrant undergrowth, he rejoiced at its capacity to find his bearings. Suddenly he heard a cool sound of running water. No better music could exist in the world. A brook quivered on flat stones in a tunnel formed by the foliage. Martin got down on his knees, quenched his thirst, and heaved a deep sigh. He lit a cigarette. In the brilliant air the match burned with an invisible flame, and from its sulphur and sweetish taste spread to his tongue. Thus, sitting on a rock and listening to the brook's gurgling, Martin enjoyed his fill of viatic freedom from all concerns. He was a wanderer, alone and lost in a marvelous world, completely indifferent toward him, in which butterflies danced, lizards darted, and leaves glistened the same ways they glisten in a Russian or African wood. It was long past midday when Martin reached Mollenac. So this was where they sparkled at night, the lights which had beckoned him ever since his childhood. Silence, a burning heat. Through the naughty streamlets of water that ran by the narrow sidewalk shone its varicolored bed, made of broken crockery. On the cobblestones, timid, dreadfully emaciated white dogs were napping. In the middle of a small square stood a monument, a female personage, with wings, raising a banner. First of all, Martin visited the post office, a cool, darkish, and drowsy place. There he wrote his mother a postcard to the accompaniment of the piercing complaint of a horsefly, one of whose legs had got stuck in the glue of the treacle-colored fly-paper affixed to his window ledge. The postcard was the first of a new little batch of letters which Miss Edelweiss stored in her closet of drawers. The penultimate batch. 39. He told the woman who ran the only Mollenac inn that he was Swiss, that it was confirmed by his passport, and gave her to understand that he was long been roving the world, working at odd jobs here and there. The same information he conveyed to her brother, a farmer, purple with wine and sanguineness, by whom, in consequence of the rover's complete destitution, he was hired as a day laborer. It was thus the third time in a couple of days that Martin changed his nationality, testing the credulity of strangers, and learning to live incognito. The fact of his having been born in a remote northern land had long since acquired a shade of enchanting mystery. A carefree visitor from a distant shore, he strolled through the bazaars of the infidels, and everything was entertaining and colorful, but no matter where he might go, nothing could weaken him the wonderful sense of being different and elect. Such words, such notions and images as those that Russia had endangered did not exist in other countries, and it often happened that he would lapse into incoherence or start to laugh nervously when vainly trying to explain to a foreigner the various meanings of some special term, say, Poschlost. He felt flattered by the infatuation of the English with Chekhov, by that of the Germans with Dostoevsky. Once in Cambridge, he discovered a 16-year-old issue of the local review, a poem coolly signed A. Jameson. It began, I walk along the road alone, my stony path spreads afar. Still is the night and cold the stone, and star talks unto star, and was a shameless paraphrase of Lermontov's greatest lyrical poem. A strange pensiveness would pervade him when at times from the depths of a Berlin courtyard would rise the sound of a hurdy-gurdy, which was not aware of the tune it had borrowed, had once touched the hearts of sentimental drunks in Russian taverns. Music. Martin regretted that an inner sentimental forbade to his vocal cords the sounds of that lived in his ears. Still, when his fellow workers, young Italians, sang loudly among the branches of Provence cherry trees, Martin would start his own song, hoarsely, boldly, and phenomenally out of tune, and that song would echo the nights when at picnics in the Crimea the baritone Zaryansky, drowned out by the choir, sang about the seven-stringed companion or the little goblet. Far below him the lucrine rippled in the wind. From above the glowing blue pressed upon him, the silver-veined leaves rustled close to his cheek, and the oilcloth-lined basket suspended from a bough gradually acquired the weight as it got filled with the glossy black fruit. Martin pulled off its taut stems. After the cherries had been harvested came sun-steeped apricots and precious peaches which had to be tenderly cradled in one's palm lest they get bruised. There were other kinds of labor. Naked to the waist, his back already the hue of terracotta, Martin took humor the young maize, loosened and heaped up the soil, grubbed out with the sharp corner of his hoe the wily and stubborn speargrass, or for hours on end stood bending over the shoots of infant trees, apple and pear, clicking his pruning shears. He especially enjoyed conducting the water from the reservoir in the yard to the nurseries, where the mattocked burrows joined with one another and with the hollows dug around the stems. As the water spread all over the young plantation, it picked its way like a live thing. Here it would stop, there run on, extending bright tentacles, and Martin, grimacing occasionally from the strings of tiny thistle heads, sloshed up to his ankles in fat purple mud, driving in forcefully an iron shield for a barrier, or, on the contrary, helping a streamlet to break through. The hollowed earth would fill with bubbling brown water, and feeling in a spade, he mercifully softened the soil until something gave delightfully, and the percolating water sank around the flesh and the roots. He felt happy he knew how to satisfy a plant's thirst, happy that chance had helped him to find work that could serve to try out both his shrewdness and his endurance. Together with the other laborers, he lodged in a shed, drank as they did 1.5 liters of wine a day, and found satisfaction in looking like them, except for a little blond beard that he could quietly let grow. In the evening, before turning in, he would walk over the cork woods beyond the farm, and smoke the mews. Overhead the nightingales whistled in short rich phrases, and the pond came rubbery croaking of frogs. The air was tender and dullish, not quite twilight yet, but no longer day, and the terraced olives and the mythographic hills in the distance, and that pine standing separate on a rock. The whole landscape was reliefless and a little swoony under an evenly fading sky which oppressed and lulled one, and made one long for the vivifying stars to appear. Night fell, lights trembled on the silhouetted hills, and windows of the farmhouse lit up, and when far, far away, in the unknown gloom, a tiny rattling train would pass by unbroken into its small fiery segments, and vanish, Martin told himself with deep satisfaction that from that train, the farm and the Molinak looked like a handful of jewels. He was glad to have heeded the call of those lights, to have uncovered their lovely quiet essence. One Sunday night in Molinak, he noticed a small white house. At the foot of steep vineyards, crooked old posts said "For Sale," and indeed would it not be better to dismiss the perilous daredevil project, to renounce the desire to peer into the merciless Zorland night, and to get settled with a young wife right there on the wedge of fertile soil, waiting for an industrious master? Yes, he had to decide. Time was running out. The dark autumn night he had marked for slipping across the border was nearing, and he had now felt rested, refreshed, sure of being able to get away with any kind of impersonation, of never losing his presence of mind, of adjusting whatever and wherever it might be to the kind of life that circumstances demanded. Testing fate, he wrote to Sonia. The answer came quickly, and after reading it, Martin sighed with relief. "Stop tormenting me," wrote Sonia. "Enough, for Christ's sake. I will never marry you. Moreover, I loathe vineyards, the heat, snakes, and especially garlic. Cross me out. Do me that favor, darling." The same day he left for town on the brand-new bus, shaved off his head, fetched his valise from the inn, and walked over to the station. There, at the same table, his head on his arm, slept the same workman. The lamps were being lit, bats skimmered by, the greenish sky was fading. "Proche, proche, adieu, adieu," sounded in Martin's ears with the refrain of a Russian song as he looked at the tousled junipers on the other side of the already vibrating rails, and the signal lights at the black outline of a man pushing the black outline of a luggage cart. The night express pounded into a station. A minute later it started again, and Martin experienced a momentary urge to jump out and return to the happy fairy tale farm. But the station had already ceased to exist. He looked through the window, waiting for the appearance of his beloved lights, to bid them goodbye. Here they came, far away, spilled jewels in the blackness, unbelievably lovely. "Tell me," Martin asked the conductor, "those lights there, that's Molinak, isn't it?" "What lights?" the man asked, glancing in the window. But at this moment everything was shut out by the sudden rise of a dark bank. "In any case, that's Molinak," said the conductor. "Molinak can't be seen from the railroad." At the kiosk of the Lausanne station, Martin bought the Sunday issue of the Russian émigré paper published in Berlin. He could hardly believe his eyes when he found in the lower half of the second page the feuilleton entitled Zorland. It was signed S. Bubnov, and turned out to be a short story in that author's admirable style, with a touch of the fantastic, as critics like to put it. In it, Martin recognized with disgust and embarrassment, as if he were witnessing some dreadfully obscene act, much of what he and Sonia used to think up, now oddly illuminated by the imagination of an intruder. How treacherous she is after all, Martin reflected, in a surge of acute and hopeless jealousy, recalled having once observed Bubnov and her walking arm in arm down a dark street, and how he had tried to believe that she told him on the following day that she had gone to the movies with a Vertikanov girl. It was drizzling, and on the lower half of the mountains could be made out. When wedged among the hampers and corpulent females, he reached by public Sarabunk, the village situated at 10 minutes' walk from his uncle's villa. Miss Edelweiss knew that her son was about to arrive. For 3 days she had been expecting a wire, and had looked forward to the excitement of driving down to the station to meet him. She was in the living room doing some embroidery when there came from the garden her son's deep young voice and soft husky laughter, which was typical of his demeanor when he came back after a long separation. He was walking beside flushed Marie, who was trying to relieve him of his valise, while he shifted in from one hand to the other and back again as he walked. His face was copper dark, and the color of his eyes seemed to have paled by contrast, and he smelled wonderfully of stale tobacco, wet woolen jacket, and train. "You've come for a long, long time now," she kept repeating in a happy, barking voice. "Generally speaking, yes," Martin answered sedately. "I'll just have to go to Berlin on business in about a fortnight, then I'll return." "Oh, forget about business, it can wait," she cried, and Uncle Henry, who had just been resting in his room after lunch, woke up, listened, quickly put on his shoes, and came down. "The prodigal son," he said, entering. "Delighted to see you again." Martin touched his cheek with his own, and both simultaneously kissed the void, as was their wont on such occasions. "I hope for some time?" the uncle asked, without taking his eyes off Martin. Still staring, he groped for the back of a chair and sat down with his knees apart. "Generally speaking, yes," answered Martin, while he devoured some ham. "I'll just have to go to Berlin in about a fortnight, but I'll return." "You won't," said Miss Edelweiss, laughing. "I know you. Come, tell us how it all was. Can it be that you actually plowed and made hay and milked the cows?" "Milking is fun," said Martin, and spreading 2 fingers showed how one does it. Milking was precisely the one thing he never did at Mullinac. It was the job of his namesake, Martin Rock, and it was not clear why he began his story with this spurious detail when there was so much else authentic to tell. Next morning, as Martin glanced at the mountains, he thought again to the same sobbing tune, "Adieu, adieu," but at once scolded himself for unworthy faint-heartedness. At that moment his mother came in with the letter, and from the threshold said cheerfully, before her son would have time to assume mistakenly that it was from Sonia, "I think it's Darwin's hand. I forgot to give it to you last night." After reading the very first lines, Martin began to chuckle quietly. Darwin wrote that he was about to marry a splendid English girl that he had met at a hotel in Niagara Falls, that he was traveling around a great deal, and that in a week's time he would be in Berlin. "Do invite him here," Miss Edelweiss said quickly. "What could be simpler?" No, I'll tell you, I have to go to Berlin. It all fits in perfectly." "Martin," she began, but hesitated and stopped. "What's the matter?" he asked gaily. "How is it working out?" "Oh, you know what I mean. Maybe you're already engaged?" Martin slid his eyes, laughed, but did not answer. "I shall be very fond of her," whispered Miss Edelweiss piously. Let's go for a walk. Such glorious weather," said Martin, pretending to be deliberately changing the subject. "You go," she replied. "Like a fool, I invited precisely today the old Drouet couple. They would die of a heart attack if one tried to phone them." In the garden, Uncle Henry was adjusting a ladder against the trunk of an apple tree. Then, with greatest care, he climbed up into the 3rd rung. By the draw-well, arms akimbo, stood Marie, looking away, forgetful of the pail which overran the gleaming water. She had gained much weight during these last years, but at that instant, with the sun playing on her dress, on her neck, left uncovered by her twisted, tightly bunched-up braids, she reminded him of his fleeting infatuation. She suddenly turned her face toward him. It was fat and expressionless face.